some point in the 80s, Congress decided that it wasn't so strategic anymore, and that they had this silver stockpiled in the government warehouses, and what are we going to do with it? Well, in 1986, they started the Silver Eagle program. Officially, it's called the Silver Liberty, but everybody knows it as the Silver Eagle. And they said, what we'll do is we'll take that silver and we'll coin it. We'll coin it at the Treasury, and we will sell these coins. And it's interesting to note that the only profit center in the entire U.S. government is their mint. Everything else that the government does loses money. But anyway, coming
that is
back
interesting.
To my point, that program lasted up until, and I forget the exact year. You can look in my archives. I'm going to guess early 2000s. I forget the year. But they ran out of this strategic stockpile. All of it was used up. And that was something that myself and many others were writing about. Oh, my goodness, what's going to happen now? Well, Congress decided to continue the program, and that was voted in. And now the program continues, but the mint has to buy silver from U.S. sources and continue the Silver Eagle program. So there's no stockpile to work off. It's gone every year for the last several. That's being, every eagle that's being produced by the mint is being produced from the fact that it's, newly bought silver, if you want. And what's fascinating to me is if you look at how much is being bought. I mean, from 1986 up until about 2007, the biggest years were around 10 million ounces. It was usually under that. Then in 2008, about 20 million ounces of Silver Eagles were purchased. So it was like double in a year's time.
Fascinating. Isn't that
2009, 28 million ounces were bought. So certainly not a doubling again, but a very significant increase, an additional 8 million ounces. And this year, January, we're not quite at the very end of January, 3 million ounces. If you project that times 12, it would be 36 million ounces, and I'm not forecasting that. January is always a big month for Silver Eagles, but you can see the trend. The trend for investment silver is continuing to grow.
So do you think that the government is getting ready to bring currency in that's related to silver or backed by silver? I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. Do you think
No, I think it's a good question, and, I know, it maybe not sound like it's that smart a question or whatever, and I'm sorry to even say that, but look, I don't think that the U.S. government has any preconceived ideas about telling the public that silver is money. So no, from the U.S. perspective, no. But let me add on very quickly and very strongly, and most people still don't know this. Even silver students don't know this, and it's out there. I've written on it again and again and again. And that is that my friend Hugo Salinas Price in Mexico has advocated the return to silver as money in Latin America, starting with Mexico. He's written a proposal. Over 90% of the population of Mexico is for the idea. Every governor of every state of Mexico is for the idea. In other words, basically everybody in the country, less 10%, wants silver as money in Mexico. Unfortunately, the banking system is resistive to that idea. So will silver return as money? Probably not in the U.S. Will it return as money in Mexico? I don't know. But certainly there's a lot more energy and a lot more discussion at the legislative level and the banking system in Mexico, and no one's aware of that story. I gave that story to Atlas Silver Institute, and I defied any of the mainstream press there to pick up the story. And honest to goodness, Reuters did pick it up from the UK and ran the story. But, this is the kind of stuff you asked earlier about, why doesn't anybody know about silver? Well, I don't know. You might, just consider that in context, that there I am giving one of the main speeches at the Silver Institute 7 or 8 years ago. The mainstream press is there, and I challenge them to write one of the most significant stories about silver, and it did. It got a little blurb in there. But this is the kind of thing that goes on in the monetary system, and again, it's ignored by ignorance, bias, or neglect. Take a pick.
There's no OPEC in silver. The central banks are not in silver. In your book, you talked about that. Why?
Well,
and how do we know that? How do we know that for sure?
Well, we know that because there's no large hoards of silver held by any central bank.
Would we know?
There is of gold. So the central banks are saying by actions, not by words, that we still consider gold money because we hold it in our central bank vaults. and there's no silver to be had. I mean, if you go back, and you could look at it several ways, but to make it simple, when you go back to the Johnson administration, he said, look, silver's too valuable to be money. Well, what was he really saying? Well, what he's saying is if we've convinced the people that these pieces of paper are money rather than a representation of money, then, and they're all fooled because they're all idiots, and I'm the president, and those are my words, but that's the thinking behind it. And then what we can do is we can take all this silver and under Paul Volcker, sell it at 92.5 cents an ounce, which was a ridiculous thing to do, but that's what they did, and deplete the United States of their coinage because silver's too valuable to be quote-unquote money. And the Central Bank of the U.S. pretty much, once they did it, all the other banks, central banks around the world said, geez, if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us, So no one uses silver as final settlement anymore. And if you go to the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements,
in Switzerland,
they used to account only in gold. Now, that's probably not true the last few years. I haven't read the annual report in about 3, so I want to be very clear here. But as of a few years back, they don't care what currency you had out there or how many derivatives or how many bonds. All they wanted to know was one thing. How much gold did you have? That's what counted, nothing else. I don't think that's the case anymore because, they really can't be that strict. I mean, too many of us are too smart and look at what they actually do rather than what they say and wake up the public. But, that's the way they used to do things, and that's the way the banking system used to be. Let's face it, Bretton Woods was the agreement that we go on the United States dollar standard because the U.S. dollar was backed by gold. So it used to be sound as a dollar, as good as gold. Those are synonymous terms to the U.S. dollar. Of course, that isn't true anymore, and it wasn't true in August 15th, 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window. Why? Because they lied. They printed a lot more paper than there was gold to back it. France and others had caught on and said, you know what, a certificate that represents money can be turned in for the money. I'm doing it. And you can't do a darn thing about it for a while, and then Nixon was forced to close the window. I don't blame Nixon. I don't know if Nixon even understood exactly what was happening at the time, but his advisors did, and he had to, quote-unquote, close the gold window. Well, what's that? That's reneging on a contract. I mean, if things worked in the real world like they do in, the engineering world, like a mechanical device, I mean, once the contract is up, it could break. But, of course, in economics, that's not the case. But once you say the contract is no good, did it have major repercussions? No. Basically, the next day, everything went on just the same. But now we're starting to see the repercussions, and we have for quite some time, really. But they're subtle, and they come on slowly, and people don't know why. They don't understand it. To this day, very few people understand what's really going on.
I read in your book that, I don't know if I'm quoting you correctly, but you were talking about how if business were done using weights and measures instead of paper, that we wouldn't have the debt system that we have.
That's right.
Explain that. Explain that.
That can be proven pretty much by experiential knowledge. I mean, if you look at when the U.S. was on a gold standard, if you go back from like 1819 to 1919, a loaf of bread cost the same without varying by as much as a half a cent the whole way through, and that's because you're on an honest monetary system. If I could digress once again, I mean, my mission statement is to teach and empower people to understand the benefits of an honest monetary system. So when you're on an honest system, the inflation rate is based upon, let's call it a gold standard. So how much does gold inflate? Well, gold roughly inflates at the rate of 1.5% per year. In other words, there's usually, over time, an increase in the gold supply by about 1.5% to 2% on an annual basis. So that's your inflation rate because the money supply is increasing. I think if we were on that kind of a standard where there was truth in the financial system or the monetary system, you wouldn't have all this rampant speculation that we've seen in the last several years. Because people would take, the money more seriously, they'd be more prudent, they'd be more careful. Now, would we have the same growth rate that we had under a fiat money system? And the answer is probably not. You probably would grow the economic structure at a solid 1.5% or 2% on